New wave. What exactly is new wave? Well, it arises at the end of the 1970s, and new wave is in many ways taking the punk attitude and taking the danger out of it for record companies, turning it into a kind of a lifestyle choice, an aesthetic attitude, as opposed to a dangerous form of cultural rebellion or revolt. When you think about the story of the Sex Pistols that we talked about in the last video, and the ways in which they would create these scandals and get themselves arrested and get themselves banned, and the way in which they ended up getting 3 advances for 1 album, those are fun stories to tell. But if you run a record company, you don't want to have an artist like that. People like that are nothing but trouble. They can't sell enough records to make it worth the trouble. And so record companies were largely not so much interested in punk from that point of view, but they could see that the music might be the next big thing. And it might be the way of drawing in a whole nother generation who was maybe getting tired of this hippie rock from the first half and the middle half of the 1970s. Would there be some way that we could kind of domesticate this punk thing a little bit and make it a little bit more user-friendly? Don't take away any of its attitude, but just, you know, don't let these guys get into trouble and embarrass us, and we're losing all of their, end up with us losing all of our profits defending ourselves in court against things that they've done. And so new wave is kind of the solution. It's not punk anymore. It's new wave. In fact, I've seen a copy of a memo that was circulated at Warner Brothers, the record label, which basically had Bugs Bunny in a leather jacket with a safety pin or something, basically, you know, like this, saying, it's not punk, it's new wave. Change of label, change of approach, but let's keep the audience, let's keep the attitude. So new wave became the way of pushing back on hippie rock music in a way that would compete with hippie rock music for sales and for exposure on the radio. And you can believe the hippies knew this. And at first, new wave and punk were not very well thought of at all. They were very separated. New wave sort of reflected a sense of urban alienation, and as I say, tamed the more aggressive elements of punk. Let's talk about the American new wave groups that began to arise in late 1977 into 1978. We've already talked about Blondie and some of the groups coming out of CBGB. I mentioned in a previous video the album Parallel Lines from 1978, went to number 6 here, number 1 in the UK. The big song from that, Heart of Glass, which was a number 1 hit on both sides of the Atlantic. And interesting thing about Blondie, led by Debbie Harry as the lead singer there, is that they maybe were, to people who were hanging out in the subculture a couple years before, the group least likely to succeed. But in many ways, they were one of the most successful groups coming out of that scene once the thing turned away from sort of the harder punk thing to the more sort of pop-oriented new wave. Talking Heads also had fantastic success coming out of the CBGB scene, led by David Byrne, Tina Weymouth on bass. We've talked before about women sort of making more of a return to performing in rock music in roles other than simply the lead singer. A couple of these members of Talking Heads they were a little bit older. They'd been students at the Rhode Island School of Design, RISD as it's called in this country, a real sort of top-notch design school. So they understood art and aesthetics and irony and some of these kinds of things. And the album Talking Heads 77 from 1977 contains the track Psycho Killer, which is a really good example of the David Byrne sort of herky-jerky vocal and the kind of minimalistic rock sort of rhythmic patterns and harmonic stuff that goes behind his minimalistic or his herky-jerky sort of vocal approach. From 1978, probably the breakthrough album for them is a song called More Songs About Buildings and Food, featuring their version of Al Green's Take Me to the River, a number 26 hit in this country, and one that got them really onto the radio and into the awareness of a lot of people. When I talk about new wave, and both these groups, Blondie and Talking Heads, are important, we're going to talk about the idea of irony. That is, how did these new wave groups actually use the past, images from the past, ideas from the past? When they moved to return to simplicity, they tried to return to an idea of simplicity that had been developed by their understanding of late 50s and early 60s, or music from the first half of the 60s, rock and roll. So we're talking about songs that in many ways, not so much the Talking Heads, but in some of these other groups, go back to rather naive, romantic lyrics, but lyrics that we all know they're not really authentically advocating that. They're using all of this in quotation marks. So as we look at these different groups, we see the irony. So Debbie Harry looking like Marilyn Monroe. That's not just an accident, that's on purpose. And not because she just liked the way Marilyn Monroe looked and wanted to look that way too. It's because Marilyn Monroe had already become a kind of historic icon in popular culture, thanks to people like Andy Warhol and all of those movies that she did and all that. So there was a way to sort of quote her or put her in quotation marks, to use that image ironically as part of forming an image for Blondie. Talking Heads also, to that degree, sort of scaling their sound down to approach something like a 60s sound, but a 60s sound sort of in quotation marks. Some other groups, new wave groups that really made it into the mainstream in a big kind of way as well. The Cars, coming out of Boston, led by Rick Ocasek. That debut album of theirs, simply entitled The Cars, is from 1978. Two big hits on that, My Best Friend's Girl and Just What I Needed. If you were going to hear maybe the first new wave album a rock listener would have bought if they were just sort of testing the water, might have been that first Cars record, because when you listen to it now, it sounds like it's sort of a cross between new wave and Foreigner or Boston or something like that. In fact, produced by a guy by the name of Roy Thomas Baker, who produced a lot of those other records on the non-new wave rock side of the fence. Anyway, the Cars are a big group. Tom Petty, we thought, was kind of ironic initially, but it turned out that Tom Petty was never sort of ironically quoting the Byrds and Roger McGuinn and all of that music. He just really liked it. And when we start to get into the 80s, I'll talk about Tom Petty as being important as a kind of a new traditionalist, in the sense that what we took for irony in the context of New Wave, because it was sort of looking back at music before Sgt. Pepper, before the hippie rock that sort of it's in contrast to. We thought that was ironic, or at least it was in league with groups like the Cars, who were using the sort of, cheap Hammond or the cheap Farfisa organ kinds of sound, or Vox Continental organ sounds, and drawing all kinds of stylistic markers from earlier music. We thought that's what Tom Petty was doing, but it turns out that Tom Petty actually just liked that music, and the music business sort of came to him. He'd been playing Byrds-sounding music ever since he started. In fact, his music sounds so much like the Byrds that his 1977 song American Girl was playing on the radio, and Roger McGuinn heard it on the car. Roger likes to tell this story, and he said, "Well, that's a great song. When did I record that?" "Hey, I didn't record that. That's somebody else." It turns out it was Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers out of Gainesville, Florida originally, but via Los Angeles. The big album for them, the breakthrough album, the #2 album from 1979, Damn the Torpedoes, Don't Do Me Like That, and Refugee, the two big songs on that for those of you who are followers of guitars. A lot of people fell in love with Rickenbacker guitars all over again because of the one that Tom Petty is holding on the album cover, Damn the Torpedoes. Coming out of Akron, Ohio, and talk about high irony, Devo, led by brothers Bob and Mark Mothersbaugh. Their first album from 1978, question, are we not men? Answer, we are Devo! Exclamation point. Produced by Brian Eno, who will be an important producer in a lot of music coming out of the 70s and into the 1980s, including U2 and groups like that. Anyway, they do a version of I Can't Get No Satisfaction as if it's being done by robots. Right? This is they come out in outfits, sort of matching outfits. There are two guys with the first name Bob in the band. So one of them's called Bob 1, the other's called Bob 2. I mean, this is just full of irony. Again, sort of art school students who sort of understand how to use all these rock images and images of what the future would have been like, what we thought the future was going to be like in the 50s, and how now in the late 70s we know it's not going to be that way, so we can ironically use these images of future and science and all these kinds of things in these ironic kinds of ways. That's what Devo is doing at this time. If they're coming out of Akron, Ohio, coming out of Athens, Georgia, is the B-52s, featuring lead singer Fred Schneider and the two female backup singers wearing beehive hairdos, right, coming right out of the 60s. All of it, again, very ironic in a certain sense. In 1979, their album, The B-52s, has the song on it called Rock Lobster. And it's hard not to listen to Rock Lobster and hear the irony in it, between the kind of pre-psychedelic kind of cheesy organ and the surf guitar licks and all that sort of put together with a kind of herky-jerky vocal, not unlike Talking Heads, and you get a music that's a kind of a collage or a synthesis, not so much a synthesis, more like a collage of various kinds of pre-hippie musical references, all being used in a very kind of ironic way, as a way, well, we'll talk about this in a minute, but I think more as a way of protesting against hippie music than endorsing pre-hippie music, but we'll get to that. One last group we could talk about on the American scene, the Knack, coming out of Los Angeles and led by Doug Fieger, were so eager to get the Beatles vibe going on that their first album wasn't called Meet the Knack, which would have been Meet the Beatles, right? It's Get the Knack. What's interesting about that is Meet the Beatles was not even an official British release Beatles record. It was the Capitol. The American record that was on Capitol was called Meet the Beatles, right? The original British version for the Beatles was called With the Beatles. But the idea that it was on Capitol was called Meet the Beatles. When Doug Fieger does Get the Knack, he records it with Capitol Records and makes them go back to the label logo that they used back in 1964. It had since changed a couple of times, but he wants the old one that looks like the Beatles label, right? There's a picture that looks very much like Meet the Beatles on the front of the record, and on the back there's a picture of them looking like they're on the Ed Sullivan Show or something. They're playing, they've got the matching suits, the narrow ties, you know. Fieger is sort of standing there looking an awful lot like John Lennon. There are cameras, you know, television cameras around them on what looks like a television set and all this kind of thing. Very much trying to get the Meet the Beatles, Ed Sullivan Show kind of thing going on. Well, it worked. It was a #1 album in 1979, and the song My Sharona, a #1 hit. All you've got to do is play the first lick from that tune, and you get everybody in the room to sing My Sharona along with you when it gets to the appropriate point. Well, let's, in the next video, turn to the British New Wave groups and have a look at what they were up to.